Welcome to another episode of Tear Talk. I am probably going to be smiling this whole time because this is the first time that I have control of the show. So we have a great guest today, and I'm very excited to actually talk to this guest of ours because he almost never, I don't think I've seen you not be in the driver's seat. Maybe once or twice, maybe Russ might have taken over. But anyway, tonight we have a great topic coming your way, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I will introduce the topic shortly, but we're going to go to our sponsor first, and then when we come back, we will get right to it.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
And we're back. So tonight we're going to be talking about desensitization. But before we do that, let's bring on our special guest for the night. We have Anthony Gangi joining us tonight. Anthony, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I heard good things about this show. And thank you for the Tear Talk.
You're quite welcome. Tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I have about probably between 18, 19 years in the correctional business. Started as an officer, moved my way up to administrative level. I have a great book on the market called Inmate Manipulation. It's about inmate manipulation, pretty much what the title says. And I am so looking forward to having this dialogue. I think it's a great topic. You said it's what is that word again?
Desensitization.
Can we, does it have to be so many syllables?
Listen, I know we have a good time when we get together, but this topic is actually very serious. Just so that you guys know, we're going to kind of just start from the top, just explaining a little bit about desensitization. So my little twist on it is that in our setting, desensitization really is this process where we diminish these emotional and the emotional responses that we have to situations that we see in front of us. So just think about the codes we have to respond to. We think about sort of all of the inmate manipulation and such that we deal with. You know, what does that look like in us as individuals? Tony, do you have any thoughts about desensitization?
Yeah, I actually do think it's a great topic. Obviously, being an officer myself at one point, there are a lot of things that you're exposed to that really, it's not the normal. And you have to be careful if you decide to make it the normal, because then you wind up turning yourself off to concerns that do require some level of emotion. That's why, again, that off and on switch, I'm not a big fan. I think it takes it becomes confusing in my mind. I think you have to be able to deal with your emotions and not pretend that you're someone else when working behind the wall. And I think that's where we need good support, good peers, good, management has those SISM teams, whatever you can put in play to help people battle through those emotions. And then obviously when they go home, they still have a stable mindset. But yes, I think it's a great topic. It has to be discussed.
All right. So I wanted to bring you back to the beginning of your career. Can you tell me about your first code response? When you responded to your first significant code, what did that feel like? What would that look like? Do you remember what it was?
You know, I don't know if it's my first code, but I can definitely talk about the one that I felt had a lot of emotion to it, because that's why I remember. Emotion ties to memory. And it is, believe it or not, it wasn't so much the fights, because we saw a lot of that. You know, working at a female facility, we did see a lot of fights. But the suicide attempt, or even the success of a suicide attempt, always got to me. Again, it's not something you see every day. Regardless of what they've done, it's still a body that's, making an effort to kill themselves. And in some cases, when it's an actual attempt and you're separated by that, the cell door, because you can't just open it, by the way, because there's policy and procedure. So once you see what's happening, most likely you're going to have to call for a response team. And all you can do at that point is try to talk the person down. But in the process, you're watching them, and they're, if they're committed to the action, you could talk until your face is blue. It's, and then you want to open that door, but you can't, because you do have it, that natural instinct to save that life. But you cannot open the door till the backup team comes in. So there's the anticipation that gets to you, the person doing it, that gets to you. I don't care what anybody says. People think we're cold to that. We're not, regardless of what they've done. And then if the team does come a little late, I could have done something, even though you did what policy says. As a human, it's hard to convince yourself that, you did what was right, because again, you have what policy expects, but then you have that human instinct to save that life. And the attempted suicide for me was the one that got me the most, the very first one, because I also saw the interactions of my support staff. They were all affected. They were all affected because, again, we have a purpose. That purpose is to save that life. So however we view it, in some cases, people may view it as, well, I know that inmate, so there's a bit of a difference when the life is taken, right? There's a change there. Or my job was to protect that person. I failed. Or am I going to lose my job? So it's emotional for many reasons. But the one thing that, with this here is that there were also some people that I saw that handled it in a very humorous way, actually sarcastic. Now, it's funny because at the time, without me knowing any better, I actually looked at them like, wow, they're assholes. Just because I didn't think it was funny and they're being sarcasm. But then I realized that was also a defense mechanism for them. Maybe that's how they dealt with it. At the time I didn't know that, but as I've been involved in the system a little bit longer, those people that may have cracked a joke or may have been a bit sarcastic actually have the biggest hearts. So I see that, maybe that is, so I don't actually look at them as assholes. I mean, to be honest with you, I look at them as maybe that's an immediate defense mechanism. Now, again, I don't know if it's right or wrong, because, if that's how they have to deal with it to make it better for them, I don't want the judgment of the outside to think that they're cold-hearted, but if they're doing it just to cover up that emotion, well, then I don't think that's the right thing to do. And again, to touch on that, the reason why that was important was I seen a lot of suicides, and I had a nephew that killed himself, and I couldn't find the emotion for it, because eventually I started turning myself off to it, not because I wanted to, but because you get so used to it, and then all of a sudden you realize, well, why am I feeling this? Why is everybody around me upset and I can't feel nothing? So now I start to realize that something's not normal about me. And then I had to do my best to not normalize that, even though I may have ran and responded to, let's say, 8 suicides in 1 year, attempts, or if they were successful or not. I can't normalize that, because if I normalize that, then, when I'm home, I start slowly shutting myself down. And then, believe it or not, first off, it's not healthy. But second thing is, you wind up being an outcast with your family, because they're not going to understand how you don't feel for that. Even if you say, well, I worked in a prison, I see, well, they're inmates. They don't understand that. It's like, well, you should feel it regardless. It's like, yeah, but guys, I don't. And then I started to realize, what? I have to really look inwards on myself and understand that. And I did. And I held on to whatever piece it was to make sure I balance. Obviously, the emotion, I'm not going to overreact on the scene. But if something's getting to me, I don't push it down. I don't hide it. I tell people that I can trust, who, one, at the job know how to handle it professionally with me, but then also at home. Why not? Because they know who I am outside the uniform.
So, so you touched on a lot in that. And so part of, what you bring to mind when you talk about that to me is that as human beings, we're naturally compassionate, right? And so this whole desensitizing process is kind of just not normal, right? But it's something that we need to do in order to protect ourselves, because we operate in this constant state of crisis. It's almost this cycle crisis that we can't get out of, and we can't necessarily, or we don't necessarily have the luxury of sitting back to process, right? And, as I think about the person who might have laughed or who said something sarcastic, it may not be the response that we feel would be appropriate, but at least it is a response, right? There is an emotional response to something that is not normal, and it didn't come off as what would be socially acceptable, but there still was a response, which means that person is acknowledging that something has affected them. And so for me, as I think about it, I just have to remember that, we all respond to situations differently, and that's going to look different for all of us. I had someone attempt suicide outside of my office. I remember every single detail of that event, and it was like 14 years ago. Like, and I'm like, why do I remember this? But like, how do you ever forget that someone is trying to take their life, right? And whatever that looks like, the physiological changes that I could see with my own eyes. Like, I stepped out of my office, I see this guy hanging in a bathroom that's outside of my office, and I'm calling down for the officers to come. They come running, but like, I think we have to acknowledge the normal emotions that we're going to feel. Like, in the moment, I was like frozen, but I was yelling, right? Like, I remember things being in slow motion because I was in such shock about what I was seeing. And I knew that if I didn't respond quick enough, but how many times do we go to codes that people respond in ways they're not necessarily running to the trouble, they're running away from the trouble, which we don't accept that internally, that someone would be running away from the trouble, right? Like, the expectation as officers, as staff, as responders is that we run to the trouble and we intervene, whatever that would mean. So, I think the other thing that you touch on that is really important is sort of the social rejection, right? So by social rejection, you talked about your nephew committing suicide and your family not accepting like your response, right? Like, those are inmates. This is your nephew. There is a way you're supposed to respond, right? And so I think that we have to start concerning ourselves about what is the long-term impact of that social rejection when we are in situations that we're not responding to in what would be deemed as a normal social response, quote unquote normal, because I don't know that there is a normal, right? It is however you personally feel is appropriate to respond. But what are those implications, or what do you think those implications are when we're in a facility, we are desensitized? There's like this dark side to things, right? That we kind of have to keep some boundaries around us to protect us mentally and emotionally. And then there's that other side where we aren't necessarily engaging with our families and friends in a way that would be socially appropriate or socially acceptable because of this constant cycle of crisis that we work in.
Well, you know what? Obviously, I think that this is definitely a question that we can explore on. So I think, especially if you work at a facility that's very active, a lot of the times you run on automatic. Maybe not at first, but, through the routine of things. I'm thinking of a scenario right now where, again, I got to kind of share. So I usually don't talk much about what I do because I'm so connected to the job, but I'm going to keep this as general as possible. But an inmate that died, that we were waiting for for the coroner or whatever it was, but we still have a job to do. We still have to conduct the count, and we still have to make sure the other inmates are okay, because this kind of happened overnight. And in an effort to save the inmate's life who had passed, you're going to pull the inmate out of the cell, and you're going to make all attempts until the inmate is declared deceased. So staff will exhaust all efforts to save that inmate's life. But once the inmate's been moved out of the cell and onto the tier, really can't move that inmate anymore unless, you have to take them to medical, obviously. But if you're making the attempts on that floor and you can't save the individual, and once the inmate has been declared deceased, crime scene, a bunch of stuff could happen, but you still have that count. So maybe the cell itself could be the crime scene. But I remember working with an officer who the inmate's body obstructed where he had to go do their count. And when everybody was doing the reliefs, I just saw this officer doing his count every half an hour, but stepping over the body because he had to, he had to do their count. And I'm thinking, like, I wonder if that affects him because he's on his third or fourth count and he's just, walking over the body, which, by the way, guys, we had to wait for someone to come pick up the body, but we still have other inmates. We still have, stuff to do. So I looked at this officer and I'm like, I wonder how they're affected by it. So when I did get a chance to talk to the officer, he was caught up in the routine. He didn't even realize what he was doing, stepping over the body, especially, just kind of caught up in the routine. And again, it being a very active facility. So it was nothing that stood out. But once he stopped and thought about it, now you start to see, like, holy crap, what am I doing here? Like, so I think one thing is that we run on automatic until someone tells us to slow down and stop. And it could be scary when we start to slow down at first, to start seeing the things that we kind of ignored. And then we suddenly come to a halt and now it's right in front of us. So I think that relates to the work part. I think your family, they hold on to who you are outside of the uniform. So we kind of talked about the need to kind of, let them know on some things, especially if you feel it's going to have an impact on who you are emotionally, because that's where you're most vulnerable. So you have to let your family know, this is what I saw today, or this is what I'm dealing with today, and I need your help. I mean, I don't have to spill it out like, the bloody, it's not about that, but maybe just a general idea where they're able to, well, you know what, Tony, as opposed to Officer Gangi, I know you. And even if it's just a vent and they hold you for a little bit or whatever it is, but the point is you're letting it out. So when you start to get home and you're able to slow it down, you look in the car next to you, you have a passenger with you and they're seeing the same things, and then when you finally stop, they're with you, so you're not facing the obstacle alone. The biggest concern I have is if you don't do that and you decide to kind of take the journey alone, you're going to change. You're going to not be yourself. And then your family is just not going to know how to help you, because one thing is they don't know what your problem is. Second thing is they don't know who you are, because you've changed so subtly, over time, that you don't realize it until years down the line when, no one's around to talk to you, because you don't realize, but those changes have pushed your family away. So I think for the family, listen to them. If there's something going on and it requires a reaction from you that you can't seem to give, but deep in your heart you should have a reaction to it, listen to them. Because if you don't listen to them, you're going to start further and falling down the rabbit hole. And then once you lose that last bit of self that you hold on to throughout the 25 years, or however long you have this career, there is no turning back. Your family's gone. They don't know how to help you. And then you wind up just, falling into whatever it is, depression, God forbid, drinking, drugs, and dying at 54 to 56 years old, which is, pretty much the age range for us.
Wow. So we talked a little bit prior to our show, we talked a little bit about, this whole desensitizing. And I think one thing that really comes to mind for me is that, we are seeing this population at the worst time of their lives, right? Like we're seeing the worst of the worst at the worst time in their lives, most of the time, right? And we're also expecting the worst, right? We're expecting manipulation. We're assuming the worst and kind of hoping the best. And so, I'm kind of just in this place where I think about, what does it feel like as we're walking around with this glass half empty, half full, but we go the half empty, right? Like it's kind of hard to see the positive in this environment sometimes. And so do you have like any tools or tricks or tips that kind of help keep you grounded and not become desensitized in this environment?
All right. So one thing is being positive is shifting reality. Being optimistic is seeing the tunnel, right? So I would kind of lean away from being positive sometimes, because that sometimes could be a lie to yourself. sometimes you're shit is just, there's no, yeah, but you know what I'm saying, right, Connie? I mean, sometimes there's no positive spin to what you're going to see. But even though when I say there's a light at the end of the tunnel, there is, you just have to kind of make it through. One thing for me is I allow myself to feel what I need to feel. You have to. I'm not saying I do it immediately, because I am trusted to have some level of control to deal with the incident at hand. And I also have a level of trust in myself that I can do it, be professional and whatnot. But I also have to remind you that maybe I'm not feeling it in the moment because I'm so occupied and I'm doing what needs to be done to complete whatever task I have. But I have to give myself a second to kind of process at one point what I just went through. So after I've gotten through all this, I mean, good supervisors even do debriefings right after the incident, because again, we may not be thinking because we're going through it. And then as you're driving home, it's, rotating, just kind of ruminating or whatever, going through your mind. So I think one thing is to find a moment to yourself to just kind of think about what you just went through, process it, and make sure you're honest with how you feel about it. And I really do think that sometimes you have to do that. Yes, control, but sometimes you got to do that without any influence, because you have to get a sense of yourself. But I know it's dangerous sometimes because you're going to really look inwards at yourself and you don't know what's going to come out. But you also have to know who you are. So you really should, when you're going through that experience, just find some time by yourself to process what it is, but also know if you need a resource, where to go. I would definitely recommend peers that you could trust. But I also got to lean on the family too, because they know who you are outside the uniform. You could have your peers that could relate to you on similar experiences, but I think your family knows you best, So again, either way, you have two resources, because you could also have a peer that has tremendous experience with it and can relate to you on that personal level. But I think that we may be more comfortable admitting vulnerability to someone we love, and therefore the true effort to change may come from that person who knows you best, because you're giving them a little more, as opposed to someone who may be a great help to me, but I may see that person as a peer, and I also may not want to be seen as weak. So I may accept their help, but I may not be given everything I need to get that help that, that I need to get back. So one thing is being, open-minded, understand how you're processing something. That's key. Letting your family in. We talked about that. That's something that's very important. And I think also if you need a mental health break, if you need a day to process something, take it. If management wants to say something, I disagree, because you want people that are stable on the job. So, I mean, I wish there was something, and I know this may be fruitful thinking, but, when you go through a major incident, and however we want to define it, I really wish things were automatic, because you're not going to expect us to ask for help. But once it's provided without us asking, and the people that are providing the help kind of come to you, you'll be shocked at people that actually want the help that don't admit it. So I wish there were things that were automatic, like if there was an inmate suicide, let's have an automatic response for, the people that were involved, riot, murder of an inmate, murder of a staff member, whatever it is, certain things that require an automatic reaction from the agency without the request coming from the union or the individuals in need. But definitely, after that incident, maybe a few days off, whether the agency wants to put up for it or if you can, you take the days just to get yourself refocused and got to get right back into that same environment. Because the last thing you want to do is these moments are actually going to test you to see if this is a job that you can handle. And it's okay to admit that you can't, guys. I mean, trust and believe it. It's actually tougher to admit that you can't. So I don't want people to think that it's a sign of weakness when you say this job isn't for me, or because I could do it, I'm tougher. Trust me, it has nothing to do with that. The fact is that you admitting that it's not for you, to me, is harder than me maybe faking the funk saying I can handle it. So, one thing is, bravo to people that can make that determination, because obviously you're limiting a liability as well. A chance that you could freeze when you're needed the most. But the key here is in the end is to basically find that balance that you need to keep you motivated. And if that requires you to take a few days off and then go back, but again, it's sort of also like riding that bike. If you fall and you get hurt, process it, try to understand what you need to do to continue. And then when you get a chance and you're ready, hop back on that bike. So it's a balance there where you got to take time off to recuperate, make yourself ready, but then get back on the bike and go at it again, because again, it could happen next second later, you don't know. So all I'm saying is to allow yourself that mental break.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I'm thinking more about it, I know that we've kind of focused on like sort of this negative side, right, of desensitization. And honestly, I just want us to keep in perspective, like this happens often with us because we need to be able to keep going, right? Like we need to be able to do our jobs every day. You think about like a firefighter running into a building, right? If they weren't to some degree desensitized, how do you day in and day out sort of look at someone's skin melting, right? Like there's got to be a way that you sort of mentally isolate or protect so that you can continue to be the hero. You can continue to be effective in your role. And so as I think about, officers in the housing units, right? Like the things that they see every day, like imagine if everything kind of made you like freak out, like everything made you upset, everything made you emotional. Like, I don't know how effective you would be able to be if to some extent you weren't a little desensitized so that you could kind of keep your head on straight and still be effective in your job. I think that there are ways, obviously, for us to sort of handle those situations when they arise. But I don't know that you are going to walk in as a ball of emotion, right? Like I don't know, as we're talking about it, like, so is desensitization really just you have no response to situations that we're repeatedly exposed to, or we have some response? Are there levels to the desensitization that maybe we could explore in the future? But like, I just don't want to leave it as like being desensitized is just bad. Like, I feel like there is some level of that needed in order for us to remain effective and go to work every day.
Well, I think in the moment when you're going through it, you have to react. So you, at that point, and I think we kind of touched on this before, is, you're not being overwhelmed by the moment. But that doesn't mean it's not going to affect you. I mean, as I said, afterwards, you can process it. But yes, I would like to think that because of the stuff we deal with through routine, you're going to, EMT stuff that they fall under, the stuff that they'll see. So I think that it's something that you're able to motivate to do because of that purpose of why you're doing it, but then eventually you process what it is. So I think there's a level of desensitivity at that moment, just enough to do what has to be done. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to get you later on. I think that's the thing about first responders in some sense. They're able to control their emotions for the moment, but I think at one point they're able to control their emotions in the moment because they're allowing themselves eventually to let that emotion out. If that makes any sense. Like I can't keep controlling my emotions because eventually I'm going to get overwhelmed and I'm going to blow up.
Absolutely.
So I think that when you run to the scene, you have a level of control of those emotions to get the job done. But then you have to, when able to, you got to break away and then let those emotions out. So I think that's what kind of makes us a little bit different. I agree. I think that we're able to control our emotions to get the job done. So if you want to use the word desensitivity, I get that. I do. I get that because I don't know, because sometimes the word sounds a little, now thinking of it, the word sounds a little cold,
Yes.
but I understand the context of it. So I'm going to use the context actually to kind of maneuver through the scenario. But if we can use desensitivity, and I know this ain't the proper definition, but just to keep in context what we're doing, if we can use desensitivity as a way to control your emotions, because I'm not saying desensitivity has to be permanent. All I'm saying is that I have to have enough control of my emotions to get the job done, and then I can go deal with whatever I'm overwhelmed with. So yeah, I think there is a level of desensitivity. The moment, again, that's a tough word to utilize. You know what? Let's do this. Because as I'm saying it, I'm not feeling it. So let's do this. There's a control of the emotions, however you want to label that. And then what happens here is that once the moment passes and you're able to complete what needs to be done, because we need that from our first responders. We can't get them overwhelmed by emotion because they're not going to be able to be successful or effective at what they do. But then that's because I think that they're able to have a chance to, once everything has been handled, to decompress. Would I consider that the same thing as desensitivity? That's tough, because I see that, I guess in context, I just see that as a cold term for what motivates a first responder. Because here's another thing, by the way, as I'm just thinking about it. So I would like to think that what also helps us get through these emotions is a higher purpose. So I think that also, if someone, you know what, let's do this. Someone that's a first responder is motivated to protect and serve. I would like to think that's their main motivation. I mean, that's the only motivation, technically. If you're in a prison, the need to protect my brothers and sisters, or even the need to protect an inmate. I mean, that's the reason why you're doing the job, protecting the public. So I think that is what motivates or governs that. And that kind of may override your initial reaction to run away or be overwhelmed or freeze. But once the moment passes and the need to respond isn't as evident, then the other emotions are going to come out, which could be what's normal, how I should normally react. And at that point, I don't know if that's desensitization. I think that's more of just controlling my emotions until I'm able to let it out. Am I making any sense? Or
no, it makes sense. I mean, so I started my career as an EMT, and so my motivation for being an EMT was I wanted to be able to save lives. Like I was good with my hands, and I just wanted to learn the skills needed to save a life. I thought that was just like an amazing thing to be able to do, a gift that you could give someone. It was all these things going on in my head 20 years ago, right? And so I have to say that there are situations that I walked into that, even though I was motivated by saving a life, once I was able to get out of the situation, like the emotions came down like immediately. Like I would never forget one summer, the little girl, she was riding her bike down the street in East New York, and a car comes flying down the road, knocks her off her bike. And she had like these bubbles, like, like almost like barrettes, but they look like bubbles almost in her hair. And they had like gone into her scalp. It was just all bad, right? So there's blood everywhere. There's all this stuff. My partner and I were stabilizing this kid. I mean, and like kids, like they bounce back. Like, so literally the car hit her and she got up, and they thought she was okay until she passed out. And, when you see these things happening with the body, here comes parents, the mom's crying. There's like all this emotion at the scene. And so if, as the professional, I couldn't separate my own emotions from the tears in this little girl's eyes and the pain in the mom's voice, I don't think I could have been effective in making sure she was stable and getting her to the hospital in time for the doctors to do what they needed to do for her. And I think that's sort of where we are in corrections, right? The event happens and we have to be the professionals, right? We are the professionals who go in, we try to stabilize the environment. And once the environment is stable and things are settled, there has to be a place for us to decompress. And I don't know that it makes us cold or desensitized. It just allows us to be in our professional space. And when we do have that opportunity, we can then decompress. I just feel we probably need to do a little better with giving staff the space, like the safe space, to actually decompress and get those emotions out if they so choose to.
Yeah, I don't know what made me. I mean, obviously the topic was introduced as desensitivity, but then when I kind of played the role out in my head, because you asked a very good question that, obviously I don't know what you're going to ask. We didn't discuss that. So I had to really think. So again, my empathetic side comes in. Let me play that scenario. I didn't feel comfortable with desensitivity, to be honest with you, at that point, because I took that as, I don't think I'm being desensitive at all. I still think I value what's happening. I value the moment. I just need a chance to kind of, get what I have to get done and then process what I need to process. But yeah, I actually, when the show's over, I'm actually gonna look up the definition of desensitivity to make sure, because I'm very curious, because I know for law enforcement, they keep on saying you have to be desensitized sometimes. I'm not feeling that word anymore.
Yeah, because so I think the desensitize is just really the response. Like, I think we don't want to confuse insensitivity with being desensitized, and we don't want to take empathy out of the equation, right? Because just because you can control your emotions and not respond emotionally in a situation doesn't mean that you don't have the empathy or the compassion for what's going on in the situation.
I know why I didn't feel the word. All right. So as you mentioned, I got something. So again, sometimes how my mind works is a little unique. I connect things later on. Desensitivity may be the aftermath. So basically where I had the conflict was after the concern happens, the process, the letting the emotions out. That's where, to me, the desensitivity may fall in. If I'm able to continue doing it and then, not have to let those emotions out, just kind of another suicide, that to me is the desensitivity. But when you're in the moment trying to protect the life, I think that's just more of a control of emotion. So
yes.
Let's bring my nephew back into the picture now. So after I seen a few of the inmate suicides and I no longer had a reaction to it, now I believe I've been desensitized, as opposed to going through the moment, but then still going through the process and being overwhelmed with emotion and letting that emotion out. I'm not desensitized when I'm going through it. I'm just controlling the emotion. So yeah, I think desensitized is more after the fact, when the issue's resolved and you have no emotion towards it.
Right. So the definition of desensitization is it's a process that diminishes emotional responses to a negative, aversive, or positive stimulus after repeated exposure to it.
Oh, so by the way, that's what I just pretty much said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I felt conflict, and then I was able to say, you know what, maybe that's not the right word. Because what's funny, guys, is I'm always thinking about how someone could perceive our profession and what we do. So the last thing I want them to think is that we're desensitized when we're responding to a code. It didn't sit right. I think we're actually more motivated. So I think it just comes with how you handle it after the repeated exposure.
Yeah. I think honestly, this was a really great topic that we talked about. You and I don't know if you've done a show on this previously, but I know you and I have never talked about it. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about, how many, so like if you're a medical provider out in the community and you have a patient who's, you've cared for X period of time and they start to decompensate and they go into like a hospice, right? In the community, like it's kind of, it's acceptable as the provider to like kind of check in and make sure that your patient is okay. And in facility, that's not necessarily appropriate, right? Like your care has ended, the offender has now transitioned into a different space, which is a hospice, which hospice and medical inpatient unit usually are not the same. In some facilities, it may be able to happen. But, I think the desensitization in like medical provider may be a little difficult because it's hard, that on off switch that you talked about. I don't know that you can just turn it off because that's an inmate versus if you were in the community and that was a patient, right? Like, I think that human component of compassion and having just a caring nature, I don't know that we can turn that off. And so, as I'm thinking about us just in this profession and doing our best, like, I feel like we have to allow ourselves to like experience our jobs, right? Like, because the desensitization comes in when we no longer feel the experience of what this job brings us, Any closing thoughts, Tony, on that?
Oh, first off, Connie, just tremendous to be on with you. You're such a well-accomplished author. The Cage Was Her Cocoon is a great book. I just want to mention something real quick that you touched on before you go. The switch metaphor, the reason why I'm starting to push away from it is because I've had so many people during my course of Tear Talk's no longer my show. What can I use? Over the course of what I do, they get very confused as when to turn it off or turn it on. And then it gets confused in explaining it. And I'm thinking, like, why am I stuck on that? If it becomes that confusing to so many people, then obviously there's nothing there of value in my mind, if you have to keep on explaining it and explaining it. So the point is, it's like, so I'm telling you to be yourself here and not be yourself. I learned that you have to hold on to a piece of yourself because that defines who you are in uniform and obviously who you are definitely out of uniform. And you have to hold on to that for 25 years. That's 8 to 16 hours of your day for 25 years. If you keep on turning off and turn on that switch, it's got to get confusing, But either way, I thought this was a great topic. I think it was needed. I think it, for the people that are going through something now, we just pretty much told them it's okay to feel the way you feel. And that's kind of good just to get the dialogue open, that it's okay to be vulnerable in this profession. I thought it was a great idea to have this topic, Connie. So thank you for having me on. And hopefully you have me on again. I don't know.
Well, listen, it was definitely a great experience sitting and going through this and talking through it, but also too, being on the other end of this, being the one asking the questions, and sort of controlling the conversation a little bit. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. So the show is Tear Talk. If you have not subscribed yet, subscribe, hit that bell. We want some likes and we want you to comment. You guys just bear with me as we get through this closing. I thank you guys for your time and stay safe. No one can do that but you, I swear.